This is an AQA Psychology A-Level revision video for the Paper 2 topic of approaches with a specific focus on the origins of psychology. So let's have a look at where origin sits in the bigger picture on the specification. It is here right at the top, hidden, not even a bullet point given to it, but it is a crucial part of the approaches specification. So the exam board expects you to know the origins of psychology, how psychology started, how it emerged, the role of Wundt, what introspection is, and putting that all together, how psychology emerged as a science. So before we get started on Wundt, we have to have a look at his predecessors. They are just as important as Wundt, however, Wundt is recognised as the founding father. So the reason they're important, just like Wundt, is because of their concepts that they introduced. A clear starting point for psychology. When René Descartes introduced his idea of Cartesian dualism, which seems obvious now, but in the 17th, 18th and 19th century, this was the beginning to this suggestion of dualism, that the mind and the body are actually separate. The brain is not the same as the mind, and therefore the mind should be studied entirely separately. So this recognition that the brain is a physical thing, the mind is something separate to it, so let's study the mind instead of the brain. So it's a clear starting point thanks to René Descartes. We then move on to explore the role of John Locke and Charles Darwin. John Locke introduced the concept of empiricism, that all knowledge should be derived from experience, and so we should study things scientifically. And so he had an influence on psychology as a science. He also believed that we're born as a blank slate, a tabula rasa, and that we're shaped by experiences, and that we should be studying those experiences in a scientific way. Finally, you have the role of Charles Darwin, who sort of set the stage of psychology as we know it today, because this argument that human and animal behaviour changes, and it changes as a result of adaptation and survival of the fittest, and that weaker genes and weaker behaviour in a psychological point of view gets weeded out. Only the strong and adaptive genes and behaviours will survive and reproduce and remain today. Then Wundt came along. He opened the first lab. He was the first person to start studying human behaviour, and that's why he's considered the father. He wanted to study the structure of the human mind. He wanted to break down complex behaviour into basic elements. So he was out to investigate, was there a shared human experience? Is human consciousness connected? Do we all think the same? Do we all behave the same in a set pattern, etc.? And so he created the method of introspection. It's a pioneering method, and we'll come back to that when we evaluate Wundt later on. So let's have a look whether Wundt was right and whether there's a shared experience. So often Wundt would have a metronome noise in the background. And if you're not sure of what a metronome is, you can just have a quick Google of it. There is one on Google, and you can set a different speed. But he had a metronome playing, and he would present his participants with different stimuli, like this image. So when I show this image, have a think. What do you think of? You might have thought of the temperature of the water. You might have thought of dirt, or even coronavirus, COVID, because that's associated with washing hands now since 2020 and the need to wash your hands. So that shared human experience in that we all respond to a stimuli in a certain way. Looking at the next image, you might have thought this was a cute kitten. You might have thought of your own pets in the past. And then finally, the image of red usually suggests danger or blood, just something to be cautious of. It's very bright, etc. So that idea of whether we have a shared human experience is what Wundt was after through his method of introspection. So introspection means looking into, and it is the examination of one's thoughts, getting a person to reflect on themselves and their own thoughts, as demonstrated in the image here. So subjects were presented with a problem to solve or something to memorise or a stimuli like I just did with those 3 images, and then asked to report back their inner experiences. What did they think? But introspection should always be obtained during the task rather than after to avoid memory problems, which is what Wundt attempted to do. The information could then be used to gain an insight into the nature of mental processes involved in perception. So that's amongst humans, comparing different participants' reports to the same stimuli, try and get a general theory about how we think, how we organise information in our brains, and all the other mental processes that go on. So that is Wundt's method of introspection. That is Wundt's role in the emergence of psychology as a science, and that is the reason he is the origin of psychology and given credit for that. So thinking about introspection now, opportunity to pause the video to think of some strengths and weaknesses of Wundt's method of introspection and also Wundt's contribution to psychology as a science. So all introspections were in a lab which can control extraneous variables. It's strictly controlled. He's attempting to be scientific. He was very standardised and it allowed for his methods to be replicated. All participants got the same instructions, the same stimuli, the same metronome, pace, etc. And finally, Wundt was able to separate psychology from philosophy and drive it towards science. So one could argue we would not be where we are today in terms of our understanding of OCD, depression, schizophrenia. That psychological knowledge we have because of Wundt and because of his attempts at being scientific. With that being said, there are some major drawbacks of introspection in that it's non-observable. So if we link that to the concept of empiricism, we're not being very empirical here, although Wundt was aiming to be. It's non-observable. You can't see it to verify it. You have to rely on individuals telling the truth. And so the participants might have deliberately distorted, they might have pretended to have more positive thoughts, they might not have been able to sort of keep up with the rate of their thoughts and them being able to explain their thoughts at the same time. So there might have been a delay between what's actually going on, what they're actually processing, and the reporting of it. You are unaware of any unconscious aspects of your behaviour. You're also unaware of the higher level processes that go on in your brain that you don't necessarily need to think of. So those automatic responses, you can't report those happening. And then finally, introspection produces subjective data. It is very different from person to person. So although he wanted to establish general laws, he wasn't necessarily able to do so. Nonetheless, by the 20th century, scientific status of value of introspection got questioned. Watson came along, criticised introspection for those reasons that we have said, and actually suggested we need to be more empirical, we need to actually be able to see behaviours, make things more scientific. So the behaviourist approach was born, and the behaviourist approach, you could argue, had more significance in psychology being a science, because you have people like Watson with your little Albert study from psychopathology on classical conditioning of phobias. You've got Skinner from operant conditioning and the use of the rats to empirically see the rat's behaviour and then assume, not even assume, because once you've seen it and you've tested it scientifically, you can say with confidence they are behaving that way due to positive or negative reinforcement. And these methods, these lab experiments, etc., and the scientific processes, they dominate psychology still today. So that's really crucial. If you think about cognitive psychologists and how they use lab tests to make inferences, all of the experiments from the memory topic you can use to support that point, but also the biological approach using experiments and taking advantage of technology to use brain scanning techniques. All of that demonstrates how far psychology has come since its early beginnings, but we loop back and we give credit to Wundt because psychology would not have these things here if it was not for Wundt and his attempts. Him opening the first lab and Descartes suggesting we can study the mind separately to the brain, and then Wundt's contribution of introspection, which although we criticise now, at the time was groundbreaking and it was really important to drive psychology forward. So that concludes the end of this video. Thank you for watching. I hope you found it useful.